At 6:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this evening, March 7th, 2026, just hours after invoking Article 5 against the United States and securing overwhelming NATO support for Canada's position, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney held a brief press conference in Ottawa that lasted less than 3 minutes. He stood at the podium, looked directly into the camera, and announced that effective at midnight tonight, Canada is implementing immediate and total suspension of all energy exports to the United States. No crude oil, no natural gas, no electricity. The tap is being turned off. Carney said, "For weeks, we have warned that continued U.S. aggression would force Canada to defend itself using every tool at our disposal. The United States has ignored those warnings. The United States has threatened our sovereignty, violated our trade agreements, and today attempted to block our Article 5 invocation at NATO by threatening to leave the alliance. Canada will not wait for the March 18th deadline. We are implementing Phase 2 energy measures now. At 12:01 a.m. on March 8th, all Canadian energy exports to the United States will cease. This decision is final and will remain in effect until the United States meets all 5 of Canada's requirements without qualification or delay." Carney then walked away without taking questions. Within minutes, energy markets across the world went into absolute chaos. Within an hour, the White House was in emergency session with no coherent plan. Within 2 hours, President Trump was on the phone desperately trying to reach Carney, who refused to take the call. Canada just cut off the energy supply that 60 million Americans depend on for heat, electricity, and transportation. And Trump has no way to turn it back on. I end this breakdown. I'm going to walk you through what the immediate cutoff of Canadian energy means for specific U.S. regions and industries. I'm going to show you the market reaction and why crude oil futures spiked $27 per barrel in after-hours trading. I'm going to reveal what's happening in emergency meetings across Washington as officials realize the U.S. has no short-term alternatives to Canadian supply. I'm going to explain why Carney chose to implement energy cutoff 11 days before the March 18th deadline instead of waiting. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what happens in the next 48 hours as the United States faces the worst energy crisis since the 1970s oil embargo. Subscribe to join the community and share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through what the immediate cutoff of Canadian energy actually means, because the impacts will be felt across multiple sectors starting within hours. First, crude oil supply loss. Canada currently exports 3.8 million barrels of crude oil per day to the United States, representing 60% of all U.S. oil imports. That supply goes to refineries across the Midwest, Great Lakes, and Gulf Coast regions. These refineries are specifically configured to process Canadian heavy crude. They cannot simply switch to light crude from U.S. shale production because the refining equipment is different. At midnight tonight, those 3.8 million barrels per day stop flowing. By tomorrow afternoon, refineries in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan will begin experiencing supply shortages. By Sunday, many of these refineries will have to reduce processing rates or shut down entirely. When refineries shut down, gasoline and diesel production stops. Gas stations begin running out of fuel. Prices spike. Second, natural gas supply loss. Canada exports 2.7 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day to the United States. That gas heats homes and businesses across the Northeast and Midwest, powers electrical generation plants, and fuels industrial processes. At midnight tonight, that supply stops. By tomorrow morning, utilities in New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, and other states will detect reduced pressure in natural gas pipelines. By tomorrow afternoon, utilities will implement emergency protocols, including asking customers to reduce usage and potentially implementing rotating service interruptions. By Sunday, if the cutoff continues, some regions could face complete loss of natural gas service, meaning no heat for homes and businesses during early March, when overnight temperatures are still below freezing in much of the affected area. Third, electricity supply loss. Canada exports approximately 1,400 megawatts of electricity continuously to states including New York, Michigan, Minnesota, and others. That power comes from Canadian hydroelectric facilities and is integrated into the U.S. grid. At midnight tonight, that power stops flowing. Grid operators will immediately detect the loss and will attempt to compensate by increasing output from U.S. generation facilities. But in regions where Canadian power represents a significant percentage of supply, U.S. facilities may not have sufficient capacity to fully replace the lost Canadian power. By tomorrow, grid operators may implement rolling blackouts in affected areas to prevent total grid collapse. These blackouts could last hours and could affect millions of customers. Subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you is the market reaction and why traders are treating this as the beginning of a U.S. economic catastrophe. At 7 p.m., 15 minutes after Carney's announcement, after-hours trading in energy markets exploded. West Texas Intermediate crude oil futures for April delivery, which closed regular trading at $76.30 per barrel, spiked to $103.50 per barrel in after-hours trading, a $27.20 increase, a 35.6% jump in less than 2 hours. Traders are pricing in the immediate loss of 3.8 million barrels per day of supply and the likelihood that oil prices will continue rising as the shortage worsens. Natural gas futures jumped 42% in after-hours trading as traders calculated the impact of losing 2.7 billion cubic feet per day. Gasoline futures spiked 31%. Diesel futures rose 28%. Every energy commodity tied to Canadian supply is experiencing unprecedented price increases. Stock market futures also collapsed. S&P 500 futures fell 6.8% in after-hours trading. Dow futures dropped 2,100 points. Nasdaq futures fell 9.2%. Energy stocks paradoxically fell despite rising oil prices because traders understand that refineries cannot operate without Canadian crude. So higher oil prices don't translate to profits if refineries are shut down. Utility stocks collapsed because companies face the prospect of being unable to provide power and gas to customers, which triggers regulatory penalties and potential lawsuits. Auto manufacturer stocks fell because transportation fuel shortages mean people cannot drive, which reduces vehicle demand. The entire market is pricing in economic recession or depression resulting from energy supply loss. Currency markets showed the U.S. dollar weakening 2.3% against major currencies in after-hours trading as traders questioned U.S. economic stability. Gold spiked $87 per ounce as investors fled to safe haven assets. Bitcoin surged 18% as cryptocurrency traders bet on U.S. economic chaos. Every market indicator points to the same conclusion. Canada's energy cutoff is an economic shock that the United States cannot absorb and cannot counter. Here's what happened in Washington in the hours after Carney's announcement. At 7:15 p.m., the Secretary of Energy convened an emergency meeting with representatives from major oil refineries, natural gas utilities, and electricity grid operators. According to sources, the meeting lasted less than 30 minutes because there was nothing to discuss. Energy executives told the Secretary that there are no short-term alternatives to Canadian supply. U.S. strategic petroleum reserves can provide some crude oil, but reserves contain light crude that many refineries cannot process efficiently. There is no strategic natural gas reserve. There is no way to quickly replace 1,400 megawatts of electricity. The executives told the Secretary that the U.S. faces immediate energy shortages starting tomorrow and that the only solution is for Canada to restore supply. At 7:45 p.m., the National Security Council held an emergency meeting. According to sources, officials discussed whether the U.S. has any options to force Canada to restore energy exports. The Pentagon was asked whether military action is feasible. Pentagon officials reportedly said that using military force to seize Canadian energy infrastructure would be an act of war against a NATO ally, would trigger Article 5 collective defense from the 23 NATO members who supported Canada today, and would be operationally complex because Canadian energy infrastructure is distributed across a vast geographic area, and destroying it would take months or years to repair. The intelligence community was asked whether covert action could sabotage Canadian decision-making. Intelligence officials reportedly said that Canada has already demonstrated the ability to penetrate U.S. classified systems, suggesting Canadian intelligence and cybersecurity are more capable than previously assumed, and that covert operations against Canada would likely fail and would certainly be detected. the Treasury Department was asked whether financial measures could pressure Canada. Treasury officials reportedly said that Canada has $94.7 billion in support from the Democratic Trade Alliance, has secured long-term energy purchase agreements with Asian and European buyers, and has the backing of 40 nations representing 60% of global GDP. Financial pressure on Canada would be ineffective and would trigger coordinated retaliation from those 40 nations. The consensus of the NSC meeting was that the United States has no effective tools to force Canada to restore energy supply. The only option is to meet Canada's 5 requirements to 8:30 p.m. Trump was briefed on the NSC assessment. According to sources, Trump's reaction was described as unhinged. He reportedly screamed at advisors, demanded to know why no one predicted Canada would actually cut off energy, and insisted there must be ways to retaliate. Advisors reportedly told Trump that they had predicted this, that the classified documents Canada released earlier this week included explicit warnings that Canada would cut off energy if the U.S. didn't comply, and that Trump had ignored those warnings. Trump reportedly ordered advisors to find a way to hurt Canada worse than they're hurting us. Advisors reportedly told Trump that Canada is already insulated through the Democratic Trade Alliance, and that any U.S. retaliation would hurt the U.S. more than it hurts Canada. 9:15 p.m., Trump attempted to call Carney directly. According to diplomatic sources, the Canadian Prime Minister's office refused to connect the call. A spokesperson told the White House that Prime Minister Carney would be available to speak with President Trump after the United States submits written confirmation that all 5 Canadian requirements will be met in full. Until then, there is nothing to discuss. Trump reportedly tried to call again at 9:45 p.m. and was refused again. Trump then attempted to reach Carney through intermediaries including the UK Prime Minister and the French President. According to sources, both European leaders told Trump that they support Canada's position and that Trump should simply accept the 5 requirements. At 10 p.m., the White House issued a statement. The statement said, "Canada's decision to cut off energy exports is an act of economic warfare and a betrayal of the North American partnership. This action will harm millions of innocent Americans who depend on Canadian energy for heat and electricity. Canada is acting recklessly and irresponsibly. The United States is exploring all options to respond to this aggression and to secure alternative energy supplies. We call on Canada to immediately restore energy exports and to negotiate in good faith." The statement is defensive and offers no indication that Trump will meet Canada's demands. At 10:30 p.m., congressional leaders held an emergency conference call. According to sources familiar with the call, participants included Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Speaker, House Minority Leader, and chairs of key committees. The discussion focused on whether Congress has authority to force Trump to accept Canada's demands. Legal counsel advised that Congress can remove tariffs through legislation, can appropriate funds for compensation to Canada, and can pass resolutions supporting NORAD and intelligence sharing. If such legislation passes with veto-proof majorities, Trump would be forced to either sign or watch Congress override his veto. The question is whether enough Republicans will break with Trump to achieve veto-proof majorities. McConnell reportedly told the group that after tonight's energy cutoff, he believes at least 20 Senate Republicans would vote to override Trump's veto because their constituents are about to experience energy shortages and price spikes. At 11 p.m., multiple news outlets reported that 4 cabinet members had approached Vice President with concerns about Trump's mental state and decision-making capacity. The officials reportedly asked whether the 25th Amendment, which allows the cabinet to remove a president who is unable to discharge the duties of office, should be considered. The vice president reportedly declined to engage in the discussion and told the officials to focus on resolving the energy crisis. The fact that cabinet members are even discussing the 25th Amendment indicates the level of panic within the administration. Let me explain why Carney chose to implement energy cutoff now, 11 days before the March 18th deadline, instead of waiting. According to analysts, Carney made a strategic calculation. First, the Article 5 vote today showed that 23 NATO members support Canada and view U.S. actions as a threat. That gives Canada maximum international backing for aggressive measures. Second, Every day the U.S. experiences energy shortage increases pressure on Trump to capitulate. By implementing the cutoff now, Carney gives Trump 11 days to feel the pain before the deadline, making it more likely Trump breaks before March 18th. Third, implementing now demonstrates that Canada's threats are real and that Phase 2 is not a bluff. Fourth, early implementation provides an off-ramp. If Trump accepts Canada's demands tomorrow or Sunday, energy can be restored before widespread economic damage occurs. But if Trump waits until March 18th, the damage from 11 days of energy shortage would be irreversible. Let me give you 3 scenarios for the next 48 hours. Scenario 1. Emergency capitulation. By Sunday morning, energy shortages are affecting 15 states. Gas stations are running out of fuel. Utilities are implementing rolling blackouts. Public panic is spreading. Congressional Republicans, facing constituent fury, tell Trump they will vote with Democrats to override any veto of legislation accepting Canada's demands. Trump, recognizing his position is untenable, announces Sunday afternoon that the U.S. will meet all 5 Canadian requirements. He frames it as preventing further harm to the American people rather than a surrender. Canada restores energy supply within hours. Crisis ends, but Trump is politically destroyed. Scenario 2. Desperate retaliation attempt. Trump, refusing to capitulate, orders closure of the U.S.-Canada border to all traffic, including commercial trucks. The order is designed to hurt Canada by blocking Canadian exports to U.S. markets. But the order backfires catastrophically because U.S. factories depend on Canadian parts and materials. Within 24 hours, auto plants in Michigan shut down. Within 48 hours, food distribution is disrupted because Canadian agricultural products can't enter. The U.S. economy enters freefall. Congress acts to override Trump's border closure order and to force acceptance of Canada's terms. Trump is sidelined by his own party. Scenario 3. Constitutional crisis. Trump refuses to capitulate and refuses to allow Congress to override his policies. Energy shortages worsen. By Monday, major cities face blackouts. Gas prices hit $8 per gallon. Public panic escalates to civil unrest. Cabinet members formally invoke the 25th Amendment, declaring Trump unable to discharge his duties. The vice president becomes acting president and immediately accepts Canada's 5 requirements. Energy supply is restored. But the constitutional crisis over whether the 25th Amendment was properly invoked paralyzes the government for weeks. That I'm watching energy markets when they open Sunday evening to see if prices continue spiking, whether any governors declare states of emergency due to energy shortages, and whether any congressional Republicans make public statements calling for Trump to accept Canada's demands. Canada turned off the tap. Crude oil, natural gas, and electricity supply to 60 million Americans just stopped. Markets are in freefall. Trump is desperate and has no options. And Carney is waiting for Trump to surrender. The crisis is no longer theoretical. It's happening right now, and Americans will feel the impact tomorrow morning.